Hello, I'm Mike Kivikoski. You can find me on Twitter at @mkivikoski. Please tweet questions, blah, blah. Please don't trash talk me. If you do, I will find you. So what am I? I'm a designer that develops, or I'm a developer that designs. I haven't really figured it out because I kind of straddle both worlds. When I got out of school, I worked at a product company for 3 years, and then I did my own consulting for 5 years, and then for the past year, a little over, I've worked at Cantina. Cantina is a consulting firm that's based out of Boston. We're technology agnostic, working on various projects for various companies. What's nice though is being here as a consultant, I only work on one project at a time. So for the past year, I've worked on one project with one client, and that has kind of stemmed, or that's the reason that I'm giving this talk from this. So with this project, there are 5 developers on it from Cantina. And so in the end of last year, we built a prototype for a proof of concept. That worked great. Client liked it. They wanted to hire us to do the production stuff. Great. And so it turned out that it would be the 5 of us with roughly 65 of their in-house developers. And so with that, we each broke out into several teams with a series of their developers to build out the different microservices or components of the site. But all of those pieces would all share the same styles. So we were starting to think, how can we keep everybody in sync so everyone's going to use the same UI so we're not duplicating efforts? So we decided to use modular component system. Okay, this could also be called a style guide or a pattern library. Wikipedia, our favorite place for definitions, gives us the subdivide a system into smaller parts. Right, it's pretty self-explanatory, but as a metaphor, right, think of Legos. Right, so these pieces, there's something like 900 million combinations you can do off like the 6 basic Lego pieces or something ridiculous like that. But think about when you were a kid. Mom and Dad would get you like a starter set, and you'd put it together, you'd follow the manual. Maybe you take apart half of it, you put it together again. Eventually, you start creating stuff without the manual. You get another kit, you put that together, and eventually you're starting to build some custom stuff together that's a little bit out of the box. Eventually, you end up with a whole pile, a whole arsenal of your Legos. And then you're starting to create pieces that you want from your own imagination, and you can eventually do stuff like downtown Toronto. And so, if you start to think about your style guide and your components as a series of Legos where you want them to connect easily with other components or Legos of your site, it's going to make it easier for you to build the site, to refactor the site, to maintain the site, and to add on to the site. So what are some benefits? So there's cohesion throughout the site. It doesn't look like Team X built this feature and Team Y built this feature. You get to reuse some of your UI and UX patterns. So if you've gone through user testing and such, you get to reuse a lot of that goodness. Your responsive design, so with just the amount of devices that we have out these days, making sure that stuff works on devices is very time consuming. So being able to test it once, or once per device, and then being able to put that through the app and having a pretty good feeling that it's going to work is very, very nice. And then that brings us to testing, and then also QA testing. If they know that certain modules work, right, they can ideally decrease the amount of time they have to spend on this stuff than constantly reduplicating or retesting the same components because they're built by multiple teams. Accessibility. So this goes kind of along with testing. You can make sure that you're A11Y compliant on things for color contrast and font sizes. And then your performance as well, so you can make sure that your images are being loaded correctly per device, that your CSS is refactored nice and neat if you've got JavaScript stuff, so that that's working correctly. So a lot of these benefits, when you get it working, and then it's time to build on, you feel like this. You're pretty stoked on it. So I'm just gonna let that play. Right. So let's take a few minutes and look at some real-world examples of sites or apps that do it well versus ones, well, you'll see. So the first we'll look at is Netflix. So you've got continue watching for Mike, and from this you can see I have horrible taste in sci-fi. But what I'm really interested in is the episodes list, and specifically each episode component. And so this is on the home page where it would have continue watching for Mike, recently watching for Mike, horror, sci-fi, adventure, blah, blah, blah. If you were to look on the specific show screen, you can see that the style looks fairly repeated. Once again, we have our list of episodes, and we have our episode module. If you look at both of those screens, if you inspect element, they share the same HTML and CSS structure. So they're all encapsulated within this episode lockup class. And then the progress bar actually uses the global component. So when you're watching the site and you've got the progress, it's the same component as the one that's statically shown. They just shrink down its height and size for you, but the color and everything else is the same. So I see something like this, and I'm just like, yes, yes. All right, these guys, or these people, they know what they're doing. Okay, they're reusing pieces. They're not wasting their time. All right, I took Virgin America to get over to San Francisco a few weeks ago. And so their site, when you book your flight, you go through, and as you get each piece, it gives you this nice summary. And so here we have a headline, some metadata, and a call to action, or a button. So if you inspect element on all of these, they all use the same CSS again. So it's a collapsed section. So they target the H1 without a class, which I'm not a huge fan of, and I'll talk about in a minute. But then they're using the same classes for each of them. And then on the call to action, we actually have the call to action button, a button class, which is global, and then button third, because this is the third style of button that they have available. So at this point, between these two examples, you might be thinking, like, duh, Mike, like, this is how CSS is supposed to work. I don't understand why you're showing us these examples. Hold on. Continue on the process where you book your seat and such. And so they've got this section where it's basically like the cabin taxonomy, and then underneath it, a gray info. So you've got a gray info link. So you've got a uppercase, dark text, and then you've got an underlined link and a gray text. All right? And then after you pick your section, they let you go through and pick your actual seat. And on the left-hand side, uppercase text, same font size. And then we've got an info link underneath, same font size, same color. All right, so if we compare the two of them side by side, same exact style, right? So we'll look at the top one first, and it's got fair map cabin name, and then fair map cabin info. So when I go to inspect element, the left-hand side, I expect to see these same classes. Nope. Seat section header, and then they're targeting the H1, and then seat row info underscore info. So if you want to change that stuff, you then have to do it in two different places. So I see this, and like why? Why would you do that? Like, why not do cabin name, cabin info, and then if you have additional styles for the left-hand side, give those additional classes or target their parent with additional classes. That way, I only have to change that type once, and it reflects throughout the site instead of having to go through and find all my different pieces. This next example is the cream of the crop. So Santander is a bank. It used to be sovereign. It's located in the States. I don't know if it's up here or not. But when you log in, they've got your user ID and one input, and then we've got a rounded button. It's fairly large, bold text, and then it's got black underlined text below it. Put in your username, click login, brings you to a new screen where it's password. So we've now got a bold label, a thinner text input. The login button now has this arrow. It doesn't have as rounded of a border. It's thinner, And then forgot your password is now text aligned right instead of left. And the forget your password is blue instead of black. All right. So no surprise when I look at the HTML, it's so like this is simplified, but like we've got a label, and then we've got the input, and then we've got a button. And we look at the next input, and it's completely different. So in this, we've got the label wraps the span, which wraps password, and then our input. And then we've got a div, and then our login is actually an anchor. So not only are we not reusing classes, but the HTML markup is completely different as well. All right, and so if we go further into the site, sorry these screenshots are kind of small, but they've got an amount input, and so we've got a $sign where you put an amount, and then you click go, and this is for like a quick transfer to someone. And then on their bill pay, we've got another interaction of the dollar, but this time the dollar is inside the input, and your input is right aligned as opposed to left aligned, and then instead of go, it's make payments. So if we look at this HTML, so we've now got a label, we've got an input type text, but now we have an input type submit. So in 3 instances of button, we've had a button, an anchor, and an input type submit. On the next one, it's a label, an input, and an anchor. So imagine coming onto this team and having the conversation, and the requirement comes down, we need to change the background color of our buttons. Oh, okay, no problem, simple fix, right? Nope, between the background images, the different HTML markup, and the various classes that are put on all this stuff, it's gonna be chaos. Because I mean, look at, on our anchor on the right, it has a class of button directly applied to it, or BTN, I should say, where on the other one, it's the actual word button. So even the semantics of what button styles, what button is different. Think about how confusing and chaotic that's going to be to update that in 6 months. Or if you're the one with this domain knowledge and you leave, what happens for the next person, right? So I mean, why does this stuff happen? It's likely because of like company mergers, acquisitions. It's likely due to like different departments getting requests. Hey, we need this feature built. We need this feature built, and you've got this tight deadline, of a month or whatnot. So it's just scramble, 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 smash it all together, send it to production. There's probably not a whole lot of code reviews or style reviews going on within that, and then the good old like legacy code stuff. Oh, Bob from IT built this like 2 years ago, so we're stuck with it. All right, and so like this is the reaction you're gonna have coming into this stuff. So what I suggest doing is as you build your new pieces or your new app, stop designing the whole screens and start designing the different components and how those are gonna work together, so that you can reuse those in your new screens to make life a little bit easier. And so Brad Frost has coined this as atomic design, so creating design systems within 5 distinct levels. And from his website, he shows what he calls his 5 levels. So he's got atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages. The atoms would be like the specific small pieces, so your button style for your submit, and then your input form. And then your molecules would be those together. And then the organisms could be multiples of those, or if you also had labels. And then you could put that into a template where it's like a transfer money or a login form. And then you can put that into any of your pages. All right. When you start to think component-based, and you start to work component-based, you can actually start to build faster and easier, and you can actually start to sketch your layouts with the concept of these pre-built components. So you can sketch them out on a piece of paper, so like component X will go here, component Y will go here. You could do it in Photoshop or Sketch if you have it and you want a visual mock-up. Or you can start to do it with actual HTML. So if we were going to rebuild the Netflix examples, so in this, we created episodes. And so inside of that is our episode component, which has the image, number, title, length, and summary. Right? And so this is the bare bones basic piece of that episode's component. Right? If we wanted to create the page where you see like the entire series, right? So we've got our series, the series name, the synopsis, and then it's just all the episodes that get listed. So right here we've sketched out how the layout for each show's page will look, in a bare bones way. Say we want to go a level higher and we want to show everything from that genre. So we have our headline 2, and then we list all the series. So if it's sci-fi or horror or recently watched, we now have that screen basically prototyped. And then if we want to do your landing page where it's genre, 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 we can just sketch that out. And so it all cascades down to basically our element structure. Right. So a benefit of this is you can decrease design time. You can get a faster testing of your ideas because you can put this stuff together, see it, put it in front of users, put it in front of stakeholders. If you've got these hypotheses that you're trying to prove true or false, you can use this stuff to get there a lot faster. So how do you start? A couple simple rules. Use classes instead of IDs, because IDs can only be used once per page. The single responsibility principle, so each element or each component or each class should only be responsible for really doing one thing. Allow them to combine with each other. If you're going to use Sass or less or soon in CSS4, use variables. And then review everything, both code review and style stuff. So on our current project, we have each team has a weekly half-hour meeting with the design team where we review the stuff we've been working on for the past week as it's put together. And so design can comment on what things have changed or what things are wrong or what we need to adapt. All right. Harry Roberts, CSS Wizardry on Twitter, had this really great example about the single responsibility principle in which he uses a sandwich. So in this case, the sandwich is an ID, so it can only be used once. And then it's bread, meat, the salad, and the sauce are all combined to that one sandwich. So if we were going to make a sandwich for everyone in the room, everybody gets this one sandwich, and you don't get to customize it to your needs. Instead of doing something like this, we should break each of those options out into their own class, and then this gives us a way to configure, multiple amount of sandwiches so everybody in the class or everybody here gets to eat what they want. So this takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's actually very, very nice. And so when you're starting with this stuff, the more stuff that you can get to be reusable, the better. And so using variables is going to help you big time on that. So for our typography, we put everything inside a variable, and we use a scale. So this is an example of the modular scale. Ideally, you're using some sort of type scale in your web app. And then these font sizes will actually get put on classes specific for typography. So instead of my H1 getting font size up 5, I'll actually create a class called headline 1, because sometimes semantically I might want H2 or an H3 to visually be the most important thing, but the H1 will be semantically the most important thing, but it won't be as visual. Does that make sense? Cool. Your color palette. So this is one where I see lots of trouble and fail happening. So we use variables for colors, but instead of calling stuff like blue, dark blue, XXXXX, dark, semi-dark blue, light blue 1, light blue 112 version final, stuff like that, is our neutrals are gray dash 100, gray dash 200, et cetera, so that it mimics the actual font weight CSS property of 100, 200, 300, 400. since I've taken the screenshot, I've actually saw someone post on Twitter that for this they use neutral dash 100, 200, and I think that's a more semantic name than gray, but I think it conveys the point. And so we do the same thing with the primaries. So this is our primary, 100, 200, 300. And in theory, like in this example, primary 400 should probably be 800 because it's darker. But this is taken from the style guide from the current project we're on, which we're still iterating on. So these are things that we will change over time. But so you've got primary, your secondaries, and your tertiaries. And really, I mean, that gives you the ability to do, what, like 27 colors if you were to do 100 to 900. I mean, that's a lot of colors for any web app. But I prefer doing stuff like this rather than Sass's like built-in darken function, because one developer might use darken color 5%, another dev might use darken color 7%, someone else might use darken, or they might not use darken, they might use blue dark or whatnot. So by using all your colors in these variables, it keeps everything concise, and so that everybody can reference the same color palette. And then if you need to change something site-wide, you can just change the variable, and you don't have to worry about all this other stuff. Does that make sense? Great. All right. What's also nice is media queries within the component themselves. So if this was nav screen small, so this is my navigation for small devices, I show it, and then my media query is directly within it, and I have min width, like screen medium's a variable I set, and then I hide it for bigger screens. And this will output, just like any other CSS would, that it'll give me the media query where it will hide this small screen, nav screen small class on larger screens. I like to put media queries within components so that when I'm working on the component, there's a good chance I'm going to test it across various devices. So if I can see basically all the CSS that's affecting that within one file, that's a lot easier than looking at these main styles and then going to, media query screen medium and seeing this one, and then media query screen small, or whatever you have it called. So this just makes it easier for the developer, and then it still outputs, for the most part, the same amount of code. And then what we actually do is we create a mix-in called breakpoint. And so that breakpoint looks for the content or the variable of screen medium, and it just sets it at min width instead of max width, so that we're building for mobile first. And so by doing the mix-in of breakpoint, you can just ensure that everybody across your team is using the min width media query instead of relying on people remembering that. It's one of those small things, but it does help a lot in the code reviews, and then when you're trying to figure out when stuff breaks, if somebody's been using max width and everyone else is using min width, it's just one more thing that you have to think of. Does that make sense? Cool. File organization. Create your less or your Sass files based on your components instead of per screen. So don't do like the about screen, the contact screen, the dashboard. Break it out into like alerts, buttons, forms. The screenshot on this side is from Bootstrap. And I mean, when I'm talking about this stuff, I'm using like Sass and less interchangeably because principles, I think, apply to both. So this is going to be easier when you do this stuff, when it's like, oh, we need to update, let's pick one of these. We need to update the carousel. I know right where all my global carousel components are. I don't have to search through the home file to find that carousel, and then the about one to find that carousel. Ideally, they're the same anyways, but should go without saying, but use some sort of grid to contain all of your stuff. So this is Bootstrap's grid. Doesn't matter if it's a 4-column, 8-column, 12-column, 16, 24, I mean, whatever, as long as you're using one, because this is going to help create consistency across each page of your app. I personally, I like to put my classes like directly on my components in the HTML. And that's so if I have, in this example, so like multiple series screen. So this is going to show 4 series. And then the way the classes are set up is that there'll be 1, 2, 3, 4 on a large screen. There'll be 1, 2, 3 on a smaller screen, and there'll be 1, 2 on a tiny, tiny screen. But then I can also use series on its own screen, and I can have that be full width. So I can take my component that I've designed at basically 100% width, and then I can reconfigure its width anywhere in the app I want. Some people don't like this, and that's totally fine. I think each project calls for its own rules. And so like you could look at something like Bourbon or Thoughtbot's Neat, where you actually put the columns within the classes. So if you want something like a sidebar to never be larger than three columns, and you could put that directly within your sidebar component or whatnot. You want to check what your outputted CSS is. Oftentimes with Sass, we get a little lazy. And then when you look at what it's outputted, you've seen that you've nested like 7 levels deep of stuff. So what could really be 1 or 2 levels and very minimum, maybe like 4 lines, is now 7 or 8 levels deep and is now like 20, 30 lines. So you want to check that like what you're writing is actually going to output stuff that makes sense to use within your app. And then you want to ensure that your CSS or your Sass or your less is following the conventions of whatever your team has decided. All right, and with that, you can actually start to show errors. So this is another thing that Harry Roberts tweeted about this week. So he created this little Sass mix-in where if you're using a BEM style and the HTML doesn't follow that, it'll actually spit out an alert if you're in debugging. So this kind of stuff is nice because you can give a visual alert to the developer that, hey, while your code works, you technically did something wrong that's not following our convention. That's going to make life harder for us in a few months. So please go back and fix this. Ideally, this would be awesome as like a gulp or a grunt plugin that could spit out when people aren't following conventions so that you're not relying on this stuff within Sass, because this is looking if debug is true, and if for some reason that went into production, hopefully it never would, but the less things you have to worry about with that, the better. All right, review everything. So the variables used, make sure that they match the variables that exist and that they follow the naming schema. So if you're using like primary 100 for your colors, make sure that someone isn't using like extra dark blue. If you're using headline 1, headline 2, and it's all based off some sort of type scale, make sure someone didn't create like headline 3 3/4 and then introduced a new font size for it. When you write a component, make sure that it is reusable so that you can actually use it again in the site. Writing syntax. Oh, and then if somebody or when somebody reuses that component, make sure that it follows convention. So make sure that their HTML matches up to what the component's HTML ideally is, so that you don't have, so that while you may have one style of classes, if you then have 4 iterations of HTML of that one component, I mean, all that work is going to be pretty useless when you're trying to make updates later on. All right, and the best way to get this stuff all together so that your team, or if you're handing it off to someone, can use it, is through a Styleguide. And I mean, there are a bunch of libraries out there. These are just a few of them. And so what this does is it gives you the ability to show your different pieces, your different components, and then how to use them, and then the actual code to be used. And with this stuff, I recommend actually connecting it to your application CSS for 2 reasons. One being maintainability, so that you're not maintaining 2 different CSS code bases. And that 2, the stuff in the style guide reflects what's in the app and vice versa. So if you make updates in the style guide, it updates correctly through the app so that everything just stays in sync. All right, and with this stuff, you want it to be a living style guide. You don't want, the term out there is a zombie style guide where all this work goes into creating it and then it never gets updated. So I would recommend building one, as fast, not as fast as possible, like as soon as you start, and just start bare bones and then iterate upon it. So like Cantina redid their website 3 or 4 months ago. And so this was the first iteration for the style guide for the website, which is very, very bare bones. But it's something that gets iterated upon time and so that we know what the next version is. I'm sure at this point you've seen Lightning Design Systems from Salesforce. They did an excellent job on their style guide that's full of reference material, and it goes through and gives you what the component is, a description about it, code use, the different variations that it can be used in. And then you can also use them for your layout. So this is just a simple like 2-column grid. If you have your main container and then a sidebar, like how that should look. And if you have multiple apps or microservices where you want the same layout and you have different teams working on it, getting like this container stuff squared away off in the beginning is going to save a lot of time come down the road. So in your documentation, writing syntax examples, show every combination out there that anybody can use. Write it for a newbie, both in the project and somewhat of the CSS level. Because when someone comes in new to the team, either from a new hire or a contractor, their domain knowledge is going to be pretty slim. And if this was built 18 months ago and that team's no longer there, this might be the only thing they have to work off of. Let it evolve and don't let it die. Don't let it turn into a zombie one. Anytime you work on a component, you should update the documentation for it in the style guide. And it doesn't have to be this verbose, like 5-page document. It can be fairly concise, which is going to be better because then people will read it. But anytime you work on a component, you should update the style guide to reflect that. Even if you didn't originally create the component, it doesn't matter. You should update that content. All right, so writing examples, this is from Airbnb's JavaScript repo, where they actually give a good example and a bad example. So that coming in, you can see, all right, this isn't how we want to write it. This is how we want to write it, just so everybody's on the same page. This is one from our project. So a currency filter, it's an Angular directive that basically just wraps any currency with American dollar sign if you're in America, or if you go to a different country, and then it wraps it properly with that, and it's either left or right depending upon what country you're in. And so this talks about how to use with the basic HTML, and then how to install it in your own repo or your microservice. This is another example from the Lightning design systems. So what I like about this is that they show every single combo that you can get out of each of these elements or each of these components. And then if you drill into it, they actually give you all the classes and then what it actually does, and then if the specific class is required or not, and then what that applies to. So if you just want a tooltip, it's that one class, you apply it to a div, you're good to go. If you want the arrow to be on the right-hand side, then you also have to use the tooltip class and apply that to a div, and then your arrow's on the right-hand side, and it's no problem. All right, so making changes. When the site's built at a point where you're going back and you're refactoring things, or you're adding in components that you've missed, or you get special requests, don't make one-off classes. I'll give an example of that in a minute. But when you change stuff, try and change it as globally as possible. And then if neither of those are possible, you can create a new class, but don't do stuff like this, where it's like headline 1 with top margin for marketing, because that's basically like one and done. And anybody that's worked with the marketing team has probably experienced something like this. Instead, do like, you got your headline 1 already, and then create like a with top margin or something like that, so that you can reuse that spacing later. And then maybe you have a marketing class that I don't even know what, they want something terrible, I'm sure, so maybe you can encapsulate it within that. All right, and so this is from CSS Tricks this past week. All right, so Goofus fixes the design bug by adding an inline style. Gallant figures out where the design pattern went wrong so we can address the root cause. You want to be like Gallant and not Goofus. All right, don't go in and just make these quick ad hoc changes inside of the code base. Think about what you're changing, why you're changing, and then how you're going to change it. And if you need to have a conversation with somebody else just to bounce ideas off of, do that. There are very few instances where you need to do like a hot fix with an inline style. Like maybe if you're an e-commerce site and it's like a week before Black Friday in the States, and like 70% of your yearly revenue comes in on Black Friday, and you need to do this, like that's probably acceptable, and then you can fix it after. But for most of us, we don't need to do stuff like that. So with refactoring, don't be afraid to do it. Everything is on the chopping block. So just because something got refactored a month ago doesn't mean that bloat hasn't been added to it. So don't be afraid about going back and reviewing it. If somebody refactors your code, it's not because you suck as a developer, it's because your code sucks at the moment. And so don't take it personal, all right? And you should do the same with other people as well. If you find stuff that's wrong, if you find stuff that's wrong, find out who did it via Git, and then talk to them via Slack, or just change it if they're no longer around. Ideally, you can get to a point where you can just change stuff, and it's fine within the team. Like, nobody has an emotional attachment with the stuff they've written. And then refactor often, because as the build stuff in the project, bloat's going to be added, so you want to try and chop some of that stuff away. And from my experience, if you're like, oh, we'll create a refactor sprint in 2 sprints, that's never going to happen. You're better off trying to refactor smaller pieces within each sprint. So as you build stuff, review it. If you have half a day, look into other stuff to refactor or whatnot. But then when you're changing stuff globally, it's always like, well, how do I know that I'm not breaking everything across the site? It's like visual regression stuff or libraries has come a pretty long way in the past few years. A lot of them seem to work off reusable.js, which basically compares 2 images for you and then tells you the difference. And so with this, you do is you set up your starting point or your test data, and then you write some JavaScript tests where it's like on click, this should happen, or this component should do this, and then it'll give you screenshots of the current state, and then it'll show you the actual differences between those. So this stuff is helpful, so when you're changing stuff globally, you can ideally test and get these screenshots of where these conflicts are, and then figure out why and how it broke. So maybe you broke something, maybe someone broke something else on another page and then didn't test or didn't tell anybody. So while this isn't perfect quite yet, it's getting pretty close. And like I said, there's a lot more libraries out here than this. This was just a few of them that I snagged from like the first page of Google. And then when to start that regression testing. So in my opinion, you want to do it like after your initial components are created, or after your component is created is when you want to write the test. Because if you're working on creating a component from scratch and you have a test running, every time you save, in theory, it's going to be different than whatever your baseline is, so you're going to get constant errors and constant screenshots saying, hey, something's changed. And it's like, no, I know this. Like, I'm working on this. I know that's changed. So if you do it in the very, very beginning, you'll probably drive yourself a little mad. So once the component is created is when you should start testing. And ideally, you want to test component-based, not screen-based, so you can see how your changes have affected your site globally. So CSS Tricks and David Walsh both have 2 really good articles for an introduction on this. You can either Google that, or my slides are up on Speaker Deck, and they're already shared, so you can also find the link via that. If all of this is a bit overwhelming to start, chances are you've already used something like this in the past with other frameworks. So like Bootstrap is basically a modular component system where you can use all the stuff they've built for the most part in any order. You've also got Foundation, which is pretty much the same concept. And then even Bourbon, which is more of a mix-in library, but then they've got Neat and Bitters, which will extend it so you get the same concept as those. So either way, if you custom build it or if you use one of these other frameworks, you want to keep your communication open with the team. You want to make your style guide public, and you want to give people freedom to contribute and to break stuff and refactor and to learn. I figured I had to add like a cat gif to this. I heard that was like an unwritten rule. But if you give people freedom, they're more likely to care about the whole project, and not necessarily like the specific things they write, but they want to get stuff done right. And if you put like a keymaster or a gatekeeper in front of it, your style guide's going to die sooner than later. And so at the end of it, you want to play nice with each other. And going back to Lego, the actual words that it came from were leg got from Danish, and it means play well. And for like a mind-boggling fact, Lego switched to their current implementation of Legos in like 57 or 58. And a Lego made then has to fit with a Lego made today. So like think about that legacy of 50 or 60 years where stuff they're creating today has to work with what their parents or potential grandparents worked with. Like we complain when we have to deal with like 12-month-old code. Like think about your grandparents' work. So in the end, play nice with each other, build something that's easy to maintain, that's easy to update, that's easy to learn from. And with that, I thank you very much.